But my thesis tonight is that you and I happen to be alive in this moment when the dominant mental map that we absorb daily and is now going global is fundamentally life-destroying. It is life-destroying because it is malaligned, not just misaligned, malaligned with human nature and with wider nature. And so the challenge then is to make this turn toward life by stepping up. In my new book, Getting a Grip, the first chapter is called A Species Grows Up. And what this means for me is now we have the knowledge to look very, very much at the evidence of what is human nature and what is the nature of nature, and align then our social choices with that. But let me just describe then the dominant map that I believe has us creating this world that we as individuals abhor. I'm going to keep taking sips of this because I do have a little tickle in my throat that I don't want to take over. Thank you for the tea, Barbara. So, I'm going to try just very, very briefly, and it's a spiral inside the cover of Getting a Grip, very briefly to describe what is the dominant mental map that my hypothesis is that's taking us down, down, down. The dominant mental map starts with the premise of lack, not enoughness, scarcity. Scarcity of everything, but I call it the scarcity of goods and goodness. There's not enough stuff in the world, whether it's food or energy or parking places in Boston where I try to park. There's not enough of anything, and there's not enough goodness in us. The dominant mental map is that we are what? We are just selfish little shoppers. We are simply competitive and materialistic and very much self-centered. So if there's not enough goods and goodness, the dominant mental map tells us that we are inevitably, we have to turn over our fate to others because we just simply can't do it ourselves. We are too flawed. We lack too much. And we have to look to others to sort out this competitive struggle. We have to look to authority somewhere. Or better yet, we find an automatic force, a magical force. Ronald Reagan named it the magic of the market. Yes, a force that will, by its infallible laws, sort out outcomes for us because we ourselves are too flawed. Now, unfortunately, our notion of this infallible magical market got hooked on this peculiar idea that a market economy, because market exchanges, of course, have worked for human beings for eons, but we got this wacky notion that a market driven by one rule, that is highest return to those who already have wealth, people who own the shares and run the companies, that an economy driven by highest return to existing wealth will create benign outcomes for everybody. But instead, what does it do? It does what we all should have learned playing Monopoly, right? Actually, Monopoly was invented by a Quaker lady who wanted to, in the early 1900s, who wanted to teach us what would happen, and we didn't pay any attention. But in my household, what happened is by the end of the night, my brother had all the property, and I couldn't even afford Baltic Avenue. And that's the world we live in. Think about it. We are playing Monopoly when we could be living democracy. But we've got hooked into this giant game of Monopoly that I love it, that now I don't have to name it. Citigroup named it. Citigroup named it in 2005, and they call it a plutonomy. We live in a plutonomy, folks, and in a plutonomy, they advise their clients, you better get on the gravy train and invest in toys for the wealthy. Because we now live in an economy, they said, in which 1% of households control as much wealth as 90% of the rest of us. So here we are. Now, it would be bad enough if I stopped there, but it keeps going because the spiral of what I call the spiral of powerlessness that starts with the premise of scarcity, then ends up with such concentration of wealth that it then infuses and infects our political system, so that we end up now with over 24 lobbyists in Washington for every single person that you and I elect to represent us there. We end up with what Franklin Delano Roosevelt, well, many great leaders have warned us against, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt said it most purely and eloquently when he addressed a joint session of Congress in 1938. And he said, quote, "The liberty of democracy is not safe. If a people tolerate the growth of private power to the point that it is stronger than the democratic state itself, that, in its essence, is fascism." Now, I have to admit to you tonight, and there's a lot about courage at the end of my talk, but I haven't yet found the courage to use the F word without quoting an American president. But I'm working on it. And I heard a few of you resonate with me, so maybe that'll give me more backbone and I can even use that word without quoting FDR. But the point is then that we end up, what happens then is that we end up then, this spiral of powerlessness ends up then with this sense that things, that reinforces itself, because of course as scarcity increases, of course as, let me put it this way, as the top 1% control more wealth than the bottom 90%, then a lot of people really do experience real scarcity, right? 1/2, think of this, 1/2 of American children will live on food stamps at some point in their childhood. 1/2. That's in a country that produces almost 1/4 of world economic output. So we create the experience of scarcity, which then convinces us even further that we're all just trapped in the scarcity scare, and our sense of powerlessness and fear magnifies. So here we are. Now, the challenge then is that we end up then with the real lack. I've said that the lack of goods and goodness is myth, that actually, and I will come to this in a moment, that the more accurate picture that is aligned with our nature is a spiral of possibility, that is a spiral of empowerment. But I want to stay with lack for a minute, because this myth of the lack, that is the lack of good and goodness at the center of the spiral of powerlessness, actually ends up in a real lack, and that is the lack of a concept of democracy that is vital and strong enough to meet today's needs. That we end up with an understanding of democracy as simply elections plus a market economy, which we've proven now cannot work. India has elections and a market economy, and half the children are stunted by malnutrition. So what we end up with is what linguists call hypocognition, the lack of a concept we need to thrive. And so I want to then start to move to the positive part of this talk. And that is that we can move out of the spiral of powerlessness if we get a real grip on what is human nature and the nature of nature. So I want to just stay there for a minute and then talk about what it would look like to have because I believe we create the world according to the ideas that we hold. What would be an idea of democracy that we could believe so that we could see and birth? But let me just go back to human nature. I've talked about the good parts in us, very, very now, more and more proven by neuroscience and the new anthropology that talks about how we evolved in tightly knit tribes, raising our babies together, and so we bonded so deeply with one another and all of that. And, though, to make this turn toward life, we also have to recognize that not just a few of us, but most of us, in certain conditions, will also behave with unspeakable cruelty. So we have to embrace the whole, the good, bad, and the really ugly about all of us. And I just want to mention, just before I get to the good parts, I just want to mention just a couple of examples that have so struck me. Many of you are, for example, aware, I'm sure, of the infamous prison experiment in Stanford in 1971. Any of you know of this? This is Philip Zimbardo, who just finally was able to write his book these decades later about what happened in that experiment. He chose young people who tested normal. He tested them normal, and he put them in a mock prison setting divided between guards and prisoners. The experiment was supposed to last for 2 weeks. But Philip Zimbardo had to stop his experiment within 6 days because the guards were so brutally abusing the prisoners that there were nervous breakdowns among the prisoners.